After the brief private talk with his mother had come to a rather unsatisfying end, the door of the small room he'd been locked into for his hearing had been opened for James once again, his two guards appearing to move the chain holding him back from the chair onto both of his wrists before guiding him away. Though they weren't exactly talkative this time, James still noticed that their earlier attitudes towards him had seemingly remained consistent, as he caught a number of sharp glances from the more hostile one, who just didn't seem to be able to keep their eyes off him. The second one seemed to mostly be resigned to doing their job at this point, only paying as much attention to James as they had to make sure he wouldn't be trying anything stupid, which he quite obviously wasn't going to do. Then again, to the rest of the galaxy, that probably wasn't as obvious as it was to James himself, depending on how charitable they were feeling, at least. Either way, James didn't really feel like interrupting the uncomfortable silence, if he didn't have to for the most part, since he was still digesting the events of the unofficial hearing. They would be called back before even making it past their first destination of his campaign. Quite the glorious display. However, the end of it all wouldn't leave his mind just yet. Something about the Admiral's behaviour was irking him. Whether it was his fault or not, the fact was that he was in a pretty messed up position now. Usually, she'd be the first to give him all the shit for it, in an attempt to straighten him out. He was used to it by now. He expected that. Especially when it came down to his issues with controlling himself. After all, they were the reason she had forced him under her wing in the military in the first place. It was a huge part of what had shifted them so far apart from each other. But if all that was the case then, why had she seemed so damn proud right there? It didn't make any sense. While he got lost in those kinds of thoughts, his mind still occasionally drifted back into the present, just enough to make sure that he didn't run into anything. And if it did, he lifted his gaze for a second as he realized just where he had been led to once again. His eyes got stuck to the door just left to the direction they were going, his head inadvertently turning as he walked, since his gaze refused to leave its blank metal. That stuck out even more since it was one of the very few things not covered with thin fabric in this place, probably because it would have gotten stuck or jammed in the mechanism. Before he knew it, James's step was slowing gradually, which quickly led to the more aggressive one of his guards tugging on his shoulder with one of their thin arms, urging him to keep moving. However, James barely registered the contact as he stared at the door unmovingly, and soon enough he tilted his head up in the direction of the guards, even though his eyes still weren't looking in their direction. And he asked, "Hey, do you think I could?" "No," the grumpier guard immediately replied in an unhappy strum, before James even had time to finish his question. "Keep moving." There was another heavy tug on James's shoulder, though not quite hard enough to actually force him to walk. Quickly, James's eyes flicked over to the other guard, hoping that he may have a chance to garner some sympathy with them instead. However, although they were looking down at him with mild pity in their blue eyes, they too shook their head. "I'm sorry, but only one visitor is allowed at a time," they informed, much more professionally than their colleague. "Besides, you haven't slept or eaten or done really anything since you got here. Your sister is being taken the best of care of. You, on the other hand, still need to take care of your own needs yourself." James fought hard with himself to suppress a scoff at the best of care comment, since he knew that any human hospital, or even understaffed medbay, would have been able to get Nia back onto her feet in less than half the time the people around here would need. Maybe, if his mother hadn't already had an outburst about it earlier, he would have had one now. But as things were, he managed to keep it down by biting his tongue for a moment. With his teeth still pressing painfully into his own flesh, he glanced at the door again. He wondered if he should protest or try to argue somehow. However, there was still a tinge of reason within him that urged him to think about how long he had probably already hogged the one visitor spot for himself. Judging by 2 years' early reaction, it probably hadn't been her first time trying to get him to move during however long his trance had lasted. Especially after her "don't fight us this time" comment. It seemed like he didn't want to come quietly. Squeezing his eyes shut, he tore them away from the door again, and began to force his feet forwards once more, basically pulling them off the floor against their will. She deserved this, and he probably had a lot of explaining to do. Luckily, his guards didn't ask any follow-up questions that would have forced him to think more about that decision, as they simply continued to walk on as well, guiding him quietly to where he had to go now. Once he felt confident in opening his eyes again, he briefly glanced down at the chains around his wrists. For the first time, it actually really sank in what he had been told about his current situation, instead of just thinking about that in his near future. He was under house arrest. What did that even mean around here? Though his wondering wasn't meant to last, since he got his answer soon enough. After they had crossed what had to be an entire wing of this strange, secured building they had been transported to while he had been in delirium, the steps of his guards finally slowed down in front of an unassuming door that looked basically like any other in the building he had seen so far. It didn't help that the plaque next to it, which was fancily embroidered right into the fabric spanning over the wall itself, was written in the local Quiis language, meaning James had absolutely no idea what it said. Should he ask? Maybe, but it would probably be self-explanatory soon enough. One of the guards moved up to the door, banging against it for a moment before pressing a button that was half hidden by the fabric, a good bit above James's full height. "Please step away from the door," they loudly announced, presumably through some sort of intercom. An answer almost immediately came as a familiar voice that instantly made James's heart beat just a little bit harder replied in a very annoyed tone. "I'm nowhere near the damn door." And just judging by how echoey the voice sounded as he got picked up by the mic, that seemed to be the truth. Though James had to admit he wasn't sure what the step away from the door treatment was meant to accomplish. Shida could have been on the other side of the city, and he would have still had trouble believing that the Quiis could have fully reacted to her if she really came running at them, and that was only slightly exaggerated. Still, it seemed like the answer had given the guard the necessary confidence to open the door, while the other one quickly reached down to unlock James's shackles. At least they trusted him to not freak out the second those came off. "I'm sure your partner will explain to you how you can ask for anything you need." The friendlier of the guards quickly snuck in with a whisper while they put the chains away. Then they already gestured for James to please enter the room as soon as the door was out of the way. Giving the tree of a person one last friendly smile and nod, James didn't waste any time and quickly disappeared into the room, with the door almost immediately being closed behind him. Though as he heard the lock engage, it sort of occurred to him that this house arrest really wasn't all that different from an actual arrest, given that he had no means to leave this single room without asking for help. Maybe there was another difference. Once again, his pondering was not allowed to go anywhere, because before he had even managed to allow his eyes to make a single sweep through the entire, rather modestly furnished room, a harsh impact already shook him, as another body heavily collided with his own. Proving his suspicions that reacting to her, no matter how far away from the door she started, would prove to be a rather difficult endeavour entirely correct, Shida had crossed the entire room within fractions of a moment, and now wrapped her arms around him in a hug that was firm enough to press the air out of his lungs. He didn't find himself on the receiving end of his girlfriend's full strength all too often. However, moments like these were a good reminder that her comparative lack of stamina was only the cost for abilities that eclipsed his own by a good margin in many cases. "Hey, treasure," James said, once he had acclimated to the pressure, and he wanted to gently lift his hands up to her back. However, before he could reach it, she had already slightly pushed herself away from him again. Keeping her hands on his shoulders with a firm grip, she looked straight into his face with a deep, serious scowl on her own, as she studied him. For a moment, James very nearly thought that she was considering smacking him right across the face, with how angry at him she looked right then, and he almost braced himself in anticipation. But only almost. At his core, he had no doubt that she was never going to hit him. Well, at least not on purpose. And outside of sparring, of course. And of course, Shida didn't raise her hand against him in the end. Instead, she let out what sounded like at least a gallon of air in a long exhale, and only once her lungs had to be entirely empty She let her head drop forwards, allowing it to fall so heavily against James's chest that he let out a small oomph sound from the impact. "You're a damn idiot, James," she complained breathlessly, after taking just enough of an inhale to speak again, and her voice was muffled by talking right into his chest. Her ears hung down entirely at first, but then twitched slightly as James finally finished his motion of putting his hands onto her back. "You won't hear me argue with that," James said, and although it probably wasn't the time for it, he couldn't help but chuckle. He didn't even really know why, but he was probably just relieved. The last clear memory of Shida that had stuck in his mind was of her standing right in front of his gun, so the fact that it seemed like she had been doing at least relatively well since then put his mind somewhat at ease among everything else that had been happening. Maybe it was just the fact that one thing hadn't gone entirely wrong that told him that the universe wasn't totally against him yet, and if he was being honest, a hug had also never hurt. After letting a couple of moments go by during which he just gently held Shida, while she leaned her head against him, James finally glanced down at her and quietly asked, "How have you been doing? Are they treating you well? What about everyone else?" Shida inhaled again, more deeply this time, and hesitantly nodded her head against him. "Yeah," she said, the breathlessness of her voice now disappearing and morphing into a quiet melancholy, that however appeared to be mostly caused by pent-up emotions, which he was now finally able to process with his return. "For the most part. It's boring as sin and your phone is driving me crazy since it hasn't stopped buzzing since even before we got here. But they haven't refused to feed us yet, or anything like that, and Moore is getting what she needs to get back on her feet. My arm's also still where it's supposed to be, so it could be worse." The corner of James's lips lifted quicker than a shuttle at takeoff, as a wide smile spread across his face, more than glad that Shida could still crack jokes at their current situation. It was a shelter for him, a tiny bit of peace and quiet and normalcy within the storm raging both around and inside him. Especially since it also showed that Moore was likely out of any danger, despite the condition that James remembered her being in when he last consciously saw her. "Low blow," he snickered gently, before his brain slowly started to process the rest of her explanations. He furrowed his brow slightly at first, although then he saw a bit of an opportunity to tease right back as he added, "And maybe you shouldn't exaggerate too much. After all, my phone isn't even going right now." Releasing a huff through her nose, Shida finally lifted her face away from his chest to glance up at his, her ears twitching in an upright position as she gave him a pretty smug look, that was however still underlined by a clear expression of deep exhaustion that probably wasn't all physical. "A kingdom to have ears as bad as yours," she then both teased and lamented at the same time, as she gently pushed herself away from him and out of his grasp, slowly sauntering across the room at a leisurely pace, as she headed towards a second nearby door that wasn't the room's entrance. Putting two and two together while judging it by the many other rooms he had lived in during the past year, James could only assume that it would lead to the bathroom. With a casual gesture, Shida opened up the door, and as soon as it was out of the way, even James's maladapted ears were finally able to pick up the still rather faint sound of familiar vibrations, showing that Shida had of course been correct in her statement that the device was likely going non-stop. Stepping a bit closer, carefully, to see what caused the sound to be so muffled, James's eyes soon fell onto a small hill that consisted mostly of his very own clothes piled on top of one another, that had however seemingly been topped off with a spare blanket that was lazily tossed over it. The only things indicating that the pile of clothes served an actual purpose, instead of just being there due to undone laundry, were the soft buzzing coming from its direction, and the fact that a cable subtly stuck out of it on one side, leading to a plug in the wall not far away. "I was tempted to just let it run out of juice," Shida explained, as if she could feel that James's gaze had fallen onto the charger, and she let out a sigh. "But I figured if the thing died, people would freak even harder than they already do, so I decided to plug it in, even if it's robbing my last nerve. Luckily, I could just tell the people trying to go through me instead that I'm not taking calls at the moment." James ran a hand along his forehead, really not looking forward to what his inbox was going to look like once he started the phone up again. "Thanks," he still said to Shida, figuring that there was at least some logic to the idea that a dead phone may be perceived worse than one that was simply not picked up, even if he didn't know if he would interpret things the same way. "I'll make sure that it won't get on your nerves any longer." With that, he moved up to Shida and gently put his hands onto her shoulders from behind, leaning his head down to gently rub it against hers, which earned him a quick chuff from her side. Then he gave her a quick peck onto her hair, before pulling away again and moving to dig his phone out from under the muffling hill of fabric. "All right," Shida replied with a sigh, seemingly too tempted by the prospect of the buzzing finally ceasing to stop him. "But we're going to have a serious talk later." With that, she stepped back in the direction of the bed that had been placed in the room for them. Although it was pretty basic, the thing was once again made for people way larger than they were, meaning there was plenty of room on it. James made note of the bathroom itself as he walked through it. For the first time in ages, the option to wash themselves was actually provided to them, in form of a sanitary unit, just like the one they had used back on the GES. The sight of it made James damn near nostalgic for a moment, as he looked at the large, black, cabinet-like construction. Given the fact that he wasn't covered in any kind of blood, slime, or soot anymore, and also wasn't stinking up a storm, a thought came to him. Even though he couldn't remember it, he half suspected that someone must have dragged him into one of these things for at least a short time at some point, during the gap in between his clear memories cutting off and him coming to next to Nia on the bed. A heavy sting immediately went through him the moment the thought came to his mind. He had semi-effectively distracted himself so far, but now it all came immediately rushing back. His sister's sunken-in face, the uncharacteristic ashen colour of her usually so deep dark face, the machine that had to do the breathing for her since her body couldn't. His hand came up to wipe a welling tear away from the corner of his eye, as he did his best to not go back into another fit of crying, as he sank down to reach his hand into the pile to dig his phone out of it. Usually, he wouldn't have cared much. He wasn't exactly the type to avoid crying if he really felt like it. However, in this case, he still had a whole boatload of conversations to get through, and he really didn't want his voice to be all messed up from phlegm for that. It took him a moment of blind grabbing despite the cable's guidance. However, ultimately, he held the device firmly in his mechanical grasp and pulled it out from under the pile, immediately intensifying the sound of his buzzing as it now unrestrictedly vibrated in his hand. Looking down at it, James honestly didn't recognize the number, and the scam call fearing part of him that was still stuck in his college days honestly wondered if he even wanted to pick it up for a moment. However, ultimately, he fought down that rather childish notion and simply accepted the current call, deciding to get through it before working his way through all the ones he had missed right after. Holding the phone up to his ear, James cleared his throat before accepting the call. "James Orgit," he tried to give his usual greeting. However, it seemed that he was simply too slow today, since he was once again interrupted before he could finish. "Brother!" An unequal parts excited and agitated voice came through the phone's speaker, booming so loudly that James was forced to move the device a bit away from his ear, in fear that the constant titanus he had gotten from his reckless gunfire would be worsened even further by the sheer volume of the greeting. "Finally, I'm getting through to you. Are you well? Do you require assistance? I am not too far. I can be there in just a few days, and my entire caverns can follow swiftly at my behest if you need it. You do not stand alone in this. Just give the word. Brother, are you there?" James's admittedly very much tired brain short-circuited at the sudden barrage, causing him to mumble and stammer for a couple of moments, as he seriously struggled to even grasp who was talking to him there, until finally the right two wires crossed, sparking belated recognition in his mind. "Mougth?" he asked aloud, although it was more out of a need to vocalize the name that had come to his mind so belatedly than anything else. "What are you... With a frustrated sigh directed at himself, James stopped for a moment, to force his thoughts into order by heavily shaking his head. Then, after a deep inhale, he started again. I'm fine. Really. There's no need for you to make this an even bigger thing than it already is. The defensiveness that came along with James's words at first was simply his first gut reaction that didn't want to escalate things even further. However, just after he had spoken, his feelings already mellowed out a bit as he realized just what the Ligamordalar had promised him there.
Are you certain?
Mougth asked, with a voice that insisted on being heard, but was in no way angry at James himself. Instead, pure, unadulterated worry came along with it, despite the fact that the Colossus's words were still more akin to a mighty roar than anything that resembled a conversational voice.
After I heard that you had been attacked, I just couldn't rest. A cowardly attempt to try and smoke someone out while they are so far away from their half. If you're truly telling me that everything is fine, then my heart can finally beat easier now. But I mean what I say when I tell you just one word is enough, and the half-mountain will come down on those cowards like a thundering storm.
James could hear the colossal man's breathing get slightly heavier in agitation, and so he quickly and decisively stated, It's fine, really. My own people are already on the way, and the danger should have passed for now, so focus on your own duties. Though, I appreciate the concern. James paused for a moment, as he remembered the fact that, according to Shida, his phone had never, not even for a moment, stopped buzzing since they arrived. He glanced down at the device, which he still held a bit away from his ear. If you were so restless, how often did you call before I picked up? As Mougth released a torrent of air out of his lungs to fight down his own agitation, James could basically hear the Class 5 shake his head, as he mumbled,
Oh, I didn't count. I don't like focusing on such trifles when something serious is at stake. I'm just glad you finally picked up.
James cleared his throat awkwardly, not quite sure how to react to that information. Well, sorry for the inconvenience, was all he got out, as he stood slightly baffled by what he was hearing.
Oh, please, it was barely an effort,
Mougth stated, and the jovial, larger-than-life nature of his expressions that James knew him for slowly returned into his speech as he kept talking.
I'm just glad that everything is all right with you. As you said, I should get back to my own duties now, but I am looking forward to speaking to you again under more pleasant circumstances. Until then, do not hesitate to call me if you need me for anything. Remember, as our brother in name, you will never stand alone.
James swallowed heavily. Thank you, Mougth, he replied clumsily, now really caught at one of his least eloquent moments. Although he did manage to pull the rudder around slightly as he added in goodbye. None too far. Mougth gave a mighty hearty chuckle back at those words.
Half-mountain strength, James,
he then replied before hanging up the call, leaving James to stare back at the phone for a couple more moments, still slightly overwhelmed by it all. All things considered, he really didn't know Mougth all that well. They had maybe a handful of conversations since they had first met under slightly unfavourable circumstances, and sure, they did have a heart-to-heart about the whole being Deathworlders and sticking up for those who needed thing, with them concluding that they were brothers in name by the end. However, apparently he had never quite fathomed just how important that statement truly was to the Ligamordalar. Curiously, James opened the Missed Calls tab. On the one hand, he was sure he had more people to get back to, so seeing who had tried to reach him was the best method for that. But on the other hand, he simply had to know, and so he started scrolling for a moment. Most of the numbers had called him once or maybe twice, especially persistent ones had maybe even tried it a couple of times before presumably either trying it through some other channel, or getting the message that this one wasn't going to work for the time being. However, even as he just casually scrolled down, James already lost count of how often he saw Moughth's number represented among the myriad of other missed calls. The guy just hadn't given up. And although it was in no universe the smartest thing to have done, James couldn't help but feel slightly touched at the persistence of it. The big guy had really, truly wanted to know if he was alright. Before moving on to taking any of the other calls, James quickly made sure to save Moughth's number into his contacts, going so far as to move him into the Favours tab before he returned to the missed calls. The man had earned it. However, right after that, it was really time to see who else had been trying to get into contact with him, and for what reason it may have been. If he was being entirely honest, James was expecting the worst. After all, he had done something that may have been completely harmless in reality, but still was, to many, on the same level as mass murdering or serial puppy kicking. Therefore, he wouldn't really be able to hold it against many of his acquaintances if they had simply called in order to let him know that they were cutting ties with him now. It would hurt. It would suck. But he'd still get it. At first, he thought about organising the calls he had gotten into some sort of order of importance, and working his way downwards along that. However, after just 2 seconds of trying that, he had already lost the necessary energy. Whether he liked it or not, even if he didn't feel the least bit tired or hungry, that didn't mean that not sleeping or eating for a long while had no effects on his mental abilities. Therefore, he decided to just start at the top and slowly work his way down. Of course, first come, first served would have been a bit fairer, but those who were the first to call him were unlikely that he was feeling particularly lazy right now, and scrolling down completely first sounded like a hassle. Therefore, he pressed down on the first non-Mougth number that he saw in the list and lifted the phone to his ear, which was something that he was going to be doing a lot for the rest of the day. But at least this next number was a familiar one.
James!
Pippa's energetic voice came out of the phone after he called her.
Goodness among the stars, finally. You really had me scared for a minute there. How's your sister? She doing okay?
James released a breath through his nose while biting down onto his lip hard for a moment, as he fought down his body's desire to react to that question. She's going to live, he replied hesitantly.
Thank the stars,
Pippa replied immediately, and let out an audibly relieved breath that sounded like she was pressing a hand over her heart as she exhaled.
And what about you? How are you feeling after everything?
James scoffed slightly, mostly at himself. Like I messed up, he admitted. I mean, I didn't really have a choice, but I made one hell of a mess of things. Pippa hummed briefly in acknowledgement of that.
Well, at least that sounds like you're still healthy, she said,
though it sounded like she, too, felt like things were hugely messy.
But I really hope that your acquaintance is as trustworthy as you seem to think she is.
James swallowed heavily and released a loud breath through his nose. You know what? I trust her, but yeah, I hope so too as well, he concurred with the Marspol's assessment.
Defending your own life is nothing that you can be judged for. Not even under these circumstances,
a familiar croaking voice assured him during the next call not long after that, as Quiis forced themselves to speak audibly to make the phone call possible without the need for cameras.
In your position, nearly everyone in the galaxy would have done the same.
Yeah, well, good luck with making anyone admit to that, though, James replied, and leaned his head backwards, plopping it down onto the soft blanket while staring up at the high ceiling. By now, he had made use of the still-present pile of his own clothes, by repurposing it into an improvised seating opportunity, after he had decided to remain in the bathroom to not bother Shida with the constant talking he would have to do now. To most of them, the thought of even speaking to a realize is so incredibly alien that they can't really empathize with it in the end. Or maybe they just don't want to. Quiis released a mild verbal croak that had nothing to do with their speaking, before they answered a moment later.
You should start holding others as accountable as you hold yourself, James, they assured him. I know I am going to. Your campaign around here may be over, but mine certainly is not. And I intend to use this event as every bit of the fuel that it is going to be for our opposition.
James smirked slightly while twirling and wrapping his free hand with the sleeve of one of his jackets that was part of the pile, simply to give it something to do. That's going to be a sight to behold. I'll be sure to tune in, James assured his fellow candidate.
And you are sure you are doing all right, apart from having messed up?
The dulcet tones of Curi's artificial voice asked James, during the call following that one.
I know how heavily situations like this tend to hit you in the end. You don't have to try to spare my emotions if you need to talk about something.
James's hand closed tightly around a balled-up t-shirt, as his face shifted into an unseen grimace. "I appreciate it, Curi, I really do," he replied, keeping his voice steady despite his attempts to start shaking. "And you're right. There are a lot of things that I am going to have to talk about, but not right now, and not over the phone. It's incredibly nice of you to want to give me this outlet, but I simply need a different one." There was a moment of silence before Curi replied.
"That is all right. I know I am not the best at helping with those things."
James sat up slightly as he heard that. "Hey, that's not how I meant it." He quickly tried to assure the cyborg, but to his surprise, Curi giggled at his reaction.
"I'm not insulted, James," they assured him. "That critique was self-directed. I didn't try to imply anything by it."
Releasing a relieved sigh, James sank back into the pile of clothes and closed his eyes for a moment. "All right, as long as we're clear," he then said, before shifting a bit. "So, what about you? How have you been doing? Any news on the legal front?"
"My lawyers have been making good progress with our strategy, and discovery motions have also come out in our favor recently. However, I am still not supposed to talk too much about it. Not even to you," Curi quickly explained, and a tinge of discomfort still very audibly filled their voice whenever they had to keep something a secret. No, it's fine." James therefore quickly tried to encourage them, making it clear he wasn't insulted and also wasn't going to pry. "It's all still hush-hush, I get it. But outside of that, how have you been doing?" Curi's voice perked up slightly, at least as much as their voice box would allow, as they answered that. "According to the circumstances, I have been doing well," they told James, with a very welcome, joyful energy. "I was plagued by bad doubts for a while after you left. However, Moore's children have been keeping me incredibly pleasant company, and in addition to that, I have made a new acquaintance here on the station."
"Really?" James asked in surprise and lifted his eyebrows. "Who is it?"
"Her name is Shirin no Kava," Curi replied with a hint of excitement. "She is an Anolix liar who I am aiding in getting used to her new mobility aids, since she was heavily injured during the attack on the detention center." "I cannot believe people are still trying to make you, and by extension us as your allies, look like the criminals in this scenario," Tharavel let out with an outraged tone. The Paracene ambassador's voice was somewhere between a hiss and a chirp, and a splashing sound that followed her exclamation indicated that she was currently relaxing in some sort of pool, or otherwise provided water, as they spoke, like the semi-aquatic species tended to do. "I mean, yes. The detention center was allegedly attacked by a group of humans in Miat, but now a group of Miat has very directly and undeniably attacked you, and people are still behaving like it undoubtedly had to have been planned by your military somehow. Are they insane?"
James hummed a bit as he thought about that, by now having moved to spinning one of his by now quite heavily wrinkled shirts on the tip of his finger, making it spread out for as long as he could balance it, before it then wrapped completely around his hand from the momentum, as soon as he had to stop since it threatened to slip off. "That's the bitch about false flag ops," he then replied in a mostly neutral tone. "They can happen in all directions. From an outside perspective, either someone is trying to shift the blame onto us, or we are now trying to shift the blame onto someone else by attacking ourselves. And for everyone who isn't us or the people actually conducting these attacks, it's up to their own interpretation which of the two they find more believable." There was a loud clacking that likely stemmed from the Paracene's beak, as she let out another indignant chirp.
"Still, at this point, they're just going to hold everything that happens against you. I mean, you very publicly proclaimed that you don't want anyone to make you a beneficiary for them, since you know people will hold it against you if something happened to them. And yet they still act like you're just pretending that you think someone is after you," she lamented in serious annoyance, obviously having a very hard time to try and put herself into the galactic public's shoes here. "I mean, what else do they even want from you?" James stopped for a moment, causing the spinning shirt to once again ball around his hand, as his fingers stopped being its engine for a moment. "Well," he admitted, "to be fair, I could have handled one or two things a bit better than I did." "Honestly, The net is filled with so many loons at the moment, but it almost seems like half of the population was just replaced with opinion bots, who can do nothing but constantly copy each other's arguments in an endless loop, without being able to react to any outside influences. A much less expected caller soon complained to James across the line. Nicola, also known as the self-proclaimed spunky influencer Sassetrix, had most certainly not been on James's list of people he had in mind when he went through the calls that had reached him. However, that didn't mean that her call was entirely unpleasant. Hearing news from back on Earth that didn't come through any official filter was a welcome change of pace, at least. Everyone with half a brain is obviously hard at work with telling them they're idiots, but those idiots are persistent. I mean, everyone saw you come out of their house in nothing but your briefs on the news, and yet people are still pretending like there can't possibly be a reason that you didn't have your body cam on. James couldn't help but laugh a bit at that. You know, the real bad part is, if I wasn't the one who lived through it, I would probably be right there with them, he admitted with a melancholic sigh, and ran a hand through his hair. There's not a moment of training where they don't hammer into you that the body cams better stay on whenever you do anything, so I'm usually quite touchy on the subject as well. Nicola groaned, apparently not quite happy about James not joining in with her ranting. Yeah, but still, it's not like you did anything, she replied with a slight pout in her voice. True, but since there's no video, they can't know that, James responded with a shrug. This time, Nicola didn't sound annoyed, and instead she snorted. Wow, you're almost really starting to sound like a saint now. Maybe that's not just a dumb nickname anymore, she said, and it was very clearly intended to tease James just a bit. However, he could only shrug. I just try my best to keep in mind what I seem like from the outside looking in. After the call with Sassetrix had wrapped up, James groaned and put the phone down. He hadn't quite managed to get through all the calls he had to make yet. However, he needed a break, just for a moment. Laying on the pile, he tried to gather enough mental fortitude to at least record a "I'm fine but not taking calls right now, I will get back to you" message for anyone who would be calling him in the meantime. However, just as he had gathered the necessary energy to lift his arm, his phone already buzzed in his hand again. He glanced at it. Unknown caller. James rolled his eyes. For a moment, he seriously thought about just hanging up before even taking it. However, once again, his brain forced him to be an adult, and at least tell the caller that he would call back later. James Aldwin, he greeted. Really sorry, but I'm not taking any calls right now. Oh, but I think you're going to want to take this one. A high, male-sounding voice that was oddly familiar but didn't ring any immediate bells replied. However, although he didn't recognize who it was, something about it made the hairs on James's arm stand up. But then the caller finally gave himself away as he added, I think you are going to find it quite enlightening, Saint Aldwin.